One of the biggest challenges in monitoring and managing the world's largest coral reef system is obviously the sheer size and scale. We know the Great Barrier Reef spans an incredible 344,000 square kilometres and snakes its way almost 2,500 kilometres up the Queensland coast. Obviously, with an area of that size, bigger than some European countries, conditions on the reef can vary from one location to another. It's why the Australian Institute of Marine Science's long-term monitoring program is so important. Welcome to the latest edition of our Reef in Focus podcast. My name's Lincoln Bertoli and we're recording at the AIMS facility on Bindal Country here in beautiful North Queensland. It's been 40 years since the inception of the AIMS LTMP program, where scientists have been collecting one of the most comprehensive coral reef data sets anywhere in the world. But it's more than just numbers on a page. It tells us how the reef is faring both now and potentially into the future and helps shape our management decisions. And joining us to discuss it is the research team leader from AIMS, the LTMP project, Dr. Mike Emslie. Hello, mate.
G'day, Lincoln. How are you, mate?
Very well. And from the Reef Authority, our very own Dr. Dave Williamson from our Reef Interventions team. Hello, Dave.
G'day, Lincoln.
Mike, we might start with you, given your, familiarity with the project. Why in 1985 did we start the LTMP? Why are we monitoring the reef?
Well, 1985 was the midst of an ongoing outbreak of Crown-of-thorns Starfish, and at the time we really didn't have good reconnaissance reef-wide to be able to say how widespread this outbreak was. So the idea was to be able to conduct surveys across the length and breadth of the Great Barrier Reef to really give us an insight into how widespread that outbreak was at the time.
Take us back to then if you can, how does the program look, say, it's a bit of a rudimentary question, but how does it look compared to now?
Well, almost exactly the same in terms of the methods that we're employing in the field. So that's one of the great strengths of the LTMP, is that the same methods have been utilised over the 40 years of the data set, which is really important in terms of being able to disseminate the information about changes and be ensured that you're looking at robust change rather than a change in the sampling methodology.
And I guess when they started this program, was it designed that it was going to be, an ongoing long-term project?
Not at the inception. The inception was really just 1 to 2 years to get a feel for the spatial spread of the outbreak at the time.
Dave, if we can ask you, from your experience with the Reef Authority and, in a previous life working here at AIMS, what does, for people that don't know, what does monitoring the reef actually look like?
Well, look, we've got teams of really very capable marine operators out there conducting standardised survey methods. They use, one of their primary methods is actually using a man-to-tow methodology, where a diver's towed about 20 metres behind a small tender vessel. And they can traverse right around the perimeter of reefs and get a really good idea of the level of variability that we see across an entire reef perimeter. It's a really valuable method for that broad scale kind of snapshot of how the reef is. And when you do that same thing over 40 years, it gives us a really good idea of the temporal kind of change that we've seen, the impacts that have happened on the reef, and how the reef's recovered from those impacts.
It seems, and pardon the pun, it seems like a drop in the ocean, I guess, being towed behind, to conduct your surveys on a reef that stretches nearly 2,500 kilometres, 2,300 odd kilometres. How do you plan where you're going to go? Are they, do you prioritise? Do you sort of start at one end and go to the other? Can you explain how that sort of works?
It's probably a question better directed to Mike, how they decide where they want to go. But look, there's originally, I think in the 80s when you guys set it up, there was about 70 odd reefs in the mix. And most of those reefs, if not all, have been maintained right through to the current time. Plus there's been additional reefs that have been added. And Mikey, where are you up to now in terms of the number of reefs at the LTMP?
It's about 497 that contribute to the entire temporal series that we've man-to-towed through time. Yeah.
And are they reefs that have been previously impacted, or are they classed as sort of high priority reefs? Can you a bit of insight into that?
No, so the way you sample the reef is, as Dave pointed out, to look at a core series of reefs that you go back to each and every year. And then that gives you and the idea was to try and cover most of the environmental gradients that occur on the Great Barrier Reef. So from the inshore right to the edge of the continental shelf, but also from the north to the south. And the sampling design also incorporates really important things like the zoning. So how are green and pink zones performing compared to places where fishing occurs.
Yeah, okay. And you touched on it a little bit. What sort of things specifically are you looking for? Is it coral cover? Is it the sort of diversity of marine animals? What do you look for?
Yeah, so all of that. But as you point out, coral cover is one of the most robust kind of indicators of reef status that we use, and it's simply the percentage of the reef surface that's covered in living coral. So that tells us a lot about how healthy reefs are. Obviously, more coral is better for the reef. But then we also conduct detailed surveys that look at the different types of coral, the different types of algae, the different types of soft coral, all the fishes, and things that are killing coral, like crown-of-thorns starfish and bleaching and drupella and those types of things as well.
And across, I guess, the span of your career, what sort of things have you seen? Are conditions changing? Are they, are there things that make it worse for the better, etc.?
Well, there's been a lot of changes since I started. When I first started back in the dark ages, we were interested in fundamental questions about the ecology of the reef, and then in 1998, the first mass bleaching event happened, and that really changed the focus of a lot of the research that we've done, and particularly now that we're seeing these disturbance regimes. So not only bleaching, but crown-of-thorns starfish cyclones are actually increasing in frequency, spatial extent, and in some cases intensity, and that's causing declines in coral cover right across the marine park. So, a lot of the focus of what we do is looking how do reefs respond to the impacts of these disturbances and whether they can recover as well.
Yeah. Okay. And Dave, over to you. Mike's touched on it, I guess, a little bit, but it's arguably never been more important to be out there monitoring in terms of the Reef Authority's role in compliance and management, to know how the reefs are faring. How does it shape what we do?
Yeah, look, the absolute foundation of what we do to manage the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is the zoning system. So our network of no-take green zones that cover about a third of all the reefs in the marine park and about a third of the total area are our absolute foundational management system. If we did nothing else on the reef and just did the zoning plan, that would still be a world-leading exercise. But on top of the zoning plan, we also do things at broad scales, like Crown-of-thorns Starfish Control. We also have had huge government investment into restoration of catchments, because over the last few hundred years, we've seen massive loss of tree cover and particularly at riparian areas up creek lines and stuff. So trying to minimise the amount of sediment and topsoil and nutrients and pesticides and everything else that's running off the land into the creeks, into the sea, has been a huge initiative for the government over a number of years.
Yeah, okay.
So some of those really broad scale actions that we're doing. So compliance around the zoning plan, Crown-of-thorns Starfish Control, investment into water quality improvement, all of those things play into what we observe both on the coastal habitats, seagrass, mangroves, but also as you get a little bit further offshore into the coral reef ecosystem.
Yeah.
So where the long-term monitoring program sits is as an absolute point of truth in terms of what we've seen since 1985 to now 2026, in terms of the level of change that we're observing in this system, how the impacts of the climatic disturbance events that are fairly acute, and then the chronic things that are happening, sort of, more around fishing impacts, sedimentation and eutrophication of coastal waters, various things that cause chronic impacts on the reef. It also allows us to measure and report the outcomes and the achievements of the management systems that we put in place.
Yeah, okay.
So testing what the ecological effects of the zoning plan has been a huge thing that we've been able to test with the LTMP data. Measuring the outcomes of the Crown-of-thorns Starfish Control Program. If we didn't have the LTMP, we would not have an ability to be able to really assess the outcomes of those management actions.
Yeah, okay. And we'll touch on that a little bit further. Mike, can we just ask you around the practicalities of collecting the data and releasing it? It's an annual monitoring program, if you like. What happens? You get the data, you synthesise it, what happens next?
Well, yeah, so we spend 120 days a year at sea collecting the data, then we come back into the office, and for all the kind of imagery that we collect to quantify the benthos, that all gets run through an AI algorithm as a first pass and then checked by human observers, and then we're able to tell how much cover is associated with hard corals and etc. Once all the data's been QA/QC, we then go into reporting modes, and we have a number of different avenues for that. We've got an interactive online dashboard where the general public or anyone can go and check out the status of their favourite reef. And then each year we produce an annual report which comes out in around August each year. And that then updates everyone on what we found in the preceding 12 months and what the status of the reef is.
Yeah.
And then sets that in the context of the 40 years. So we're looking at how much coral is out there at the moment. Have we seen intensive bleaching over the preceding 12 months? Have we seen outbreaks of Crown-of-thorns Starfish? So It really gives an update of the status of all the reefs that we go and visit.
And I guess, as you said before, for someone who's been doing this since the Dark Ages, you're probably not surprised by what you're seeing. Can you sort of, I guess, before the data comes in, do you have an idea of what you're expecting?
Well, your observations in the field are driving your perception of the status of the reefs, but then it's down to the data to actually inform you on where it sits and where it is in the, I guess, comparison to previous years. So, we see a lot of impacts from a lot of different disturbances, but what's been really great is we've also seen really strong recovery and resilience across the reef as well. So even though it's a system under intense pressure, and that's only looking to get more intense as we move into the future, at present, the reef is still able to regenerate and recover from these impacts.
Yeah, okay. And Dave, you touched on it before, particularly in your role with the Crown-of-thorns Starfish Control Program at the moment. How important is this data set? Is it an example of where the LTMP data has directly influenced, what we do as a management partner?
Oh, absolutely. It's critically important. The reconnaissance data that comes in from the LTMP is essentially our point of truth of what's happening in terms of the status of coral and Crown-of-thorns starfish outbreaks on the reef. Where are they currently concentrated? They don't stay in one area over a full outbreak cycle, which can span 15 years. They tend to move their way through the park. And the LTMP over all these years has observed several of these outbreak waves go through. And so we have a pretty good indicator of where we expect the outbreaks to be at different stages of the outbreak cycle. So that's been really critical information for our understanding about how to deploy the Crown-of-thorns Starfish Control Program effort to actually put the vessels in the right places at the right time. So, it's not the only data set we use. There's other data sets that we bring in. The COTS program generates a lot of data itself. We also rely on the Reef Joint Field Management Program. And also work that's done through the tourism industry. Those sightings that they provide also provide another source of reconnaissance. So we're looking to gather as much information as possible, as many eyes on the reef as possible, to give us really robust estimates of where we need to be when to make sure we're being as effective as we can be with the Crown-of-thorns Starfish Program.
Yeah. This is a question probably for the both of you. I guess Mike touched on it before. We do see areas where there's lots of coral cover, but we are seeing that these environmental impacts are having an effect. It seems a little, I guess, almost contradictory. Mike, could I ask you, if I was to go throw a snorkel on and go out and pop my head under the water now and snorkel some nearby reefs, could you tell me what would I see? Is the reef still in pristine condition in some areas?
Yeah, certainly in some areas there's a really healthy sections of reef, but you've got to remember that these disturbances have variable impacts. So you might go out to a reef off Townsville and see, beautiful coral, lots of fishes, but then if you went down to the southern end of the reef, which got whacked in the 2024 bleaching, there'll be virtually no coral as well. And these impacts can vary even at the scale of within a reef. So there can be a section a couple of 100 metres long, perhaps it got impacted by cyclonic waves, but you could turn the corner and then you'll see, beautiful lush stands of coral as well. So that's the power of a program like this, is to be able to detect impacts and status of reefs at a number of different spatial scales to give you an appraisal of how the overall system's faring.
Yeah, okay. And Dave, you guys both sort of touched on it earlier. We are seeing, I guess, from these impacts, there are species of coral that can bounce back more quickly than others, perhaps faster growing species, etc. Putting all this together, can I ask you, mate, to start with, what are you hoping to, I guess, or what are you trying to answer over the next 10 years? What are marine scientists, like the both of you, looking to answer over this time?
Well, in my current role, what's really important is that I'm able to demonstrate, using all the data that's available to me and the skills of my team, that we're actually doing something of use on the reef is that, for 20 to currently $30 million a year investment, we have a big responsibility to make sure that we are actually deploying our resources and the assets that are available to us to best use. So with 3,500 reefs out there and something that's the size of Japan, we've got an enormous marine estate that we're responsible for. So working out how we actually amplify the benefits of the management actions that we're investing in, including Crown-of-thorns Starfish Control, but how that's used to actually augment the benefits, the underlying benefits that come from the Marine Park Zoning Plan and other things that we do on the reef, those cumulative benefits of what we're doing, is it enough to help maintain the resilience of this ecosystem into the future? And so there's some big questions around that. At this point, the reef is proving itself to be very strong. As Mike was saying, some of these corals are bouncing back incredibly quickly after storms. There was some work published several years ago that suggested that we would never see recovery, and we'd never see the reefs back to what they were pre some of the big recent bleaching events. And what we're seeing is that the reef is actually bouncing back. And yes, it is, of course, some of the very quick to grow and potentially short-lived coral species that are dominating, as you'd expect. Yeah. If we lose a 300-year-old coral, it's going to take us 300 years to grow another one. But if we lose corals that are 20 to 30 years old, those coral communities can recover within a surprisingly short amount of time. Many of the places that I've dived over the years and worked on over the years where the reef has been flattened, there's been literally nothing there. It looks like a car park. Yeah. And you can see that some of those areas will come back within 5 to 7 years. You start to see lots of recovery in there, lots of corals that are coming in and recruiting. So there's incredible ability of coral reefs to recover and bounce back. Yep. We just have to ensure that the management actions that we are taking are helping to support that natural process. Yeah. Right. At the same time, of course, the government's put a big investment into looking at other strains of coral and other types of particularly resilient types of coral, whether naturally derived or human derived. Yeah. In terms of selecting particular things that are going to do well under a changing climate. That we're still not there yet. There's great work in progress, but we're not at the point where we're out there deploying super corals at scale. Yeah. It's not the reality. What we are looking at right now is the ability of this ecosystem to restore itself. Yeah. And the LTMP is our absolute point of truth in terms of what it can do. And at some point, if these impacts keep happening, it may not bounce back the way we've seen it bounce back in the past. So without that data set, we won't have the history to tell us something about the future.
Yeah. And Mike, as you said, the technologies are, changing, but the fundamentals of the program moving forward will essentially remain the same, as Dave mentioned, because it is so vital.
No, absolutely. I mean, technology is bringing in a lot of change to how you physically collect the data, but you've got to ensure that when you are employing new technology, that it's telling you exactly the same as how you collected things in the past. So before any new technology is brought on board, we need to undergo fairly intensive calibration of the differing in the techniques and make sure that the changes that we see are not brought about by a change in the use of technology as well.
Yeah. It's an incredible milestone, guys, as we mentioned earlier. Mike, can I ask you, how has this program, after 40 years or even earlier, influenced other large-scale monitoring programs on other coral reefs around the world?
Well, I guess it really laid the blueprint for how you go about long-term, robust, rigorous scientific monitoring. A lot of our methods have been transferred to other realms around the globe. A lot of the techniques we use are relatively standard techniques in the scientific world, but certainly the way we go about things has been uptaken by other parts of the world, and particularly now the use of the AI algorithm called Reef Cloud. So a lot of programs around the world are now starting to feed photos into that database and letting the AI algorithm actually start spitting out the results for them, rather than that labour-intensive way of manually doing it that we used to. And the data also is open for use by other scientists, and in fact we've had over 160 peer-reviewed publications come out of the program, not just by AIM scientists but by collaborators all around the globe. So it's not only the methodology but also the data availability, which is one of the great strengths of the program.
Yeah, okay. Dave, you care to add to that? In your throughout your career in marine science, it seems like it's sort of largely the benchmark for this type of monitoring.
Look, in the late 90s, I set up an inshore reefs monitoring program, and that's continued just until recently. It was recently funded, via AIMS, up until last year. So that was in itself a 20-something year data set. And when I set that up, Mike was there actually helping me to get the thing going in the first place. And we modelled, much of the method on what AIMS was already doing. It's expanded in more recent years to also the marine monitoring program, which employs slightly different methods and is very focused on the benthos, the coral and the algae, rather than the fish as well. Yeah. We've talked a lot about the coral, but also the fish is a huge part of the long-term monitoring program and what we were doing on the inshore reefs, and particularly around assessing the effects of the zoning plan. I mean, we've got to remember that coral reefs are one of the most dynamic ecosystems on the planet. Coral is always bouncing around, just about everywhere it is. But the fact that we are sitting here on the doorstep of the world's arguably the best managed marine park on the planet means that we are as well placed as any coral reef ecosystem on Earth to weather some of the changes that are coming down the line at us.
Yeah, okay.
We have world-leading management. We have an incredible, naturally resilient ecosystem. I think we're as well as anyone could be placed on the planet.
Yeah.
I've worked a lot through Asia, Pacific, other places, and people would kill to have what we have here.
Yeah, exactly. And can I ask you, as we start to wrap up, for someone who's seen, more of the reef than most people ever will, you did touch on it around the resilience. What gives you hope, I guess, for the future?
Well, I think the fact that at present the reef is still resilient and can bounce back, so that gives me a lot of heart. But I don't think that resilience can be, just guaranteed moving into the future, particularly under the increasing frequency and severity of impacts that we're starting to see. We've had 6 bleaching events since 2016, and prior to that there were 1 or 2, and then prior to 98 there were virtually there. They didn't exist.
Yeah.
So, I think that is the greatest concern, and we really need to be taking, whatever action is necessary to reduce the impacts of these climatic heat stress events that are now happening virtually almost every year.
Yeah.
But to get to your question, the fact that the reef can bounce back following these disturbances does give me a lot of heart. Yeah.
Thank you again, gents. It's an incredible program. We look forward to speaking with you again, hopefully to talk about the next 40 years of the LTMP. Thank you again. Cheers. And if you enjoyed that episode, be sure to check out all our previous episodes of the Reef in Focus podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts. See you for the next one. Cheers.